Why do clans Fraser and MacKenzie dislike each other so deeply? Let's talk about it. As always, this video will have spoilers for the books and the TV show, so if you are looking to avoid those, please do keep on scrolling. So I received this question asking if there are any book references as to why the MacKenzie and Fraser clans don't like each other, and if I could give a little bit of context and backstory as to the relationship between the two, which is obviously going to be a very relevant plot point in Blood of My Blood, as Ellen is from the MacKenzie clan and Brian is from the Frasers. And while, yes, there is plenty of tension in the later years when we hear Jamie telling Claire about the marriage of his parents and how many feathers it ruffled, but this started long before these two got together, as we can see in some of the promotional material. And as I did some digging just to brush up on my history here, there's a few angles at which we can approach this. The first is actual history in Scotland between the MacKenzie and Fraser clans, because yes, this was actually historically accurate that between 1452 and 1715, which is around Blood of My Blood, the Frasers of Lovett and the MacKenzie clans were in a very bitter feud, particularly over land and territorial rights. The lands around both families are very strategic, and both families wanted to stake a claim in those lands. And I think that at the heart of everything, this time in Scotland, that was definitely not abnormal, that these two families would have a very ugly, bitter feud over land. Because back then, land is power. We know from the books, and we're likely going to get a lot more context in the show, but Brian's father, Simon Fraser, was not a very nice man, and both of these men, him and Red Jacob, were very headstrong and would likely have many skirmishes and fights and disagreements all throughout history that would have come to a head around the time that Blood of My Blood is taking place because of what was going on with the Jacobite uprisings in the Scottish Highlands. Like we saw in the main series, much of the politics in the Highlands were around creating clan alliances, and where we can see in the show that the MacKenzie family is using Ellen and Jocasta, and even in some cases the men, like Colum's arranged marriage and Dougal's as well, and Red Jacob's for that matter, to strengthen family ties, and then as a result of that have more power and influence in the Highlands. The damage would have been done by this point between the Frasers and the MacKenzies. So even though many other families were trying to get under the umbrella of the MacKenzies and have their protection, so to speak, I think Simon Fraser, who is a real historical figure, likely felt like the last thing he wanted to do on earth was align himself with the MacKenzies, who he'd been feuding with for a very long time. There are many snippets from the books that kind of discuss a little bit of the history between these two families, but this passage in particular I think is important to note because Jamie is explaining to Claire where Castle Leoch is territorially, and it falls in a freehold between MacKenzie and Fraser lands. And you can see here as he lays out that there's a lot of decent fishing, forests for hunting. It's valuable land that the MacKenzie family would love to acquire. And in many ways, Dougal is trying to do that alongside Colum once Brian and Ellen are married. Because part of the marriage agreement that they came up with said that if Ellen and Brian did not have any children and something were to happen to Ellen, Lallybroch would not go to Brian. It would go back to his father, Simon. Brian would never be able to own this house if something were to ever happen to Ellen. And we know that Ellen and Brian did have children, and they had a son who later dies at a young age. And then obviously we know that Jamie is the one who becomes the next heir to Lallybroch. But you can see here that there was very much a lot of thought going into the agreement between these two families and the property of Lallybroch because it is so valuable, and the MacKenzies did not want it going to Brian. Interestingly, in this new clip of Brian and Ellen talking at their secret spot by the bridge, Brian mentions that his father is presently living in Leathers, which is a real historical castle called Castle Leathers. And it is a site that is near Inverness, which is where Castle Leoch and Lallybroch and everything in Outlander is supposed to take place. But historically, it's associated with a Major James Fraser. Historically, it has ties to the Fraser clan, and I have yet to come across the mention of Castle Leathers in any of the Outlander books and texts, so I think that this might be a way that the Blood of My Blood showrunners are trying to interject a little bit of real Scottish history, with this site location being one associated with a James Fraser. Now, interestingly too, there's a lot of history about Dougal, and the subtext of it kind of spells out how even after Brian and Ellen's marriage and their children come into the fold, there's still a lot of animosity between the MacKenzie and Fraser clans, as seen through Dougal and his actions. Early on in Jamie and Claire's marriage, he's talking to Claire about his past, and he recalls that he was hit in the head with an axe or something, and Dougal relocated him to France afterwards. And he points out to Claire that he would have brought him to France because there was English patrols all around, and he had an English person visiting him at his home, and so it would have been safer for everyone if Jamie was not there. Jamie likes to think that Dougal was doing it to protect him, and also because he looked at him and saw that he was not in a good place, and so bringing him to the Abbey in France was probably the best place for him to get care. That conversation sort of fizzles out and then is brought up later on in their marriage when Jamie starts to explain why he came back from France to Claire and how he came into contact with the man named Horrocks. At the time, he wanted to come back to Scotland as well to see his sister Jenny after he had been, fed all this information about what had been going on with her, because remember, he witnessed her being attacked by the dragoons, and so even though it was a risk, he thought it would be a good idea to return home. And Claire asks, how did the MacKenzies come into this story that you're telling me? And this is when Jamie brings up the fact that he had wondered after he had been struck in the head all those years ago if Dougal might have been behind it. Claire can't believe that that would even be a consideration of his, and Jamie sort of tells her that that wouldn't be a surprise to him at all, because the MacKenzies are very much plotting all the time. And the reality is that when Jamie returns home from France, Colum is not doing well health-wise, and his son Hamish is very young at the time. And so obviously many members of the clan would be wondering what would happen if Colum were to die and Hamish was not ready to become laird. Claire points out that Dougal would be the natural progression if something were to happen to Colum, but Jamie reminds her that many members of the clan recognize that Dougal is not the man that Colum is, and that if there were to become an alternative option for them to root for or nominate to be laird, it would be a direct threat to the MacKenzie family. And that is when Claire starts to put together that Jamie would be that threat, given that he is the grandson of Jacob MacKenzie. He is half MacKenzie because of his mother. He is very accomplished in leading men. He has a very good intelligence from his time abroad, and so naturally many people would probably want him to be the laird. So Jamie wouldn't be surprised if his uncle is trying to eliminate the option from even becoming one. And so that's kind of an undercurrent between the MacKenzies and Frasers that was prominent even in Claire and Jamie's storyline. And when Claire asks Jamie if he would become laird if something were to happen to Colum, he says no, and then goes into his explainer as to why he behaved the way he did at the gathering that we saw in season 1. And he follows up by explaining to Claire that Dougal is always moving the chess pieces around, and by him strategically marrying Jamie to Claire, who is English and many people believe is a witch, that all but solidifies the fact that Jamie will never be a threat to Dougal, and Dougal would naturally be able to basically take over Clan MacKenzie and become laird if something were to happen to Colum. It's a very interesting family dynamic, one that I hope they'll give a broader, more interesting storyline to, beyond just they were fighting over land and power. But at the heart of it, that seems to be what the disagreement was between these two families. And then when Brian and Ellen come in and fall in love, that only makes their conflict greater, and we can see the repercussions of that in later seasons of Outlander. but good for them for falling in love and having a marriage of love amongst all of these other ones that were purely political.